welcome back to Just Vetting, where we go beyond the transaction to explore what it really takes to build, grow, and transition a successful veterinary practice. Today's guest is not just a veterinarian, he's a builder, an innovator, and someone who has operated at the intersection of clinical medicine, business strategy, and emerging technology. Dr. Mark DeWolde is a hospital founder, entrepreneur, and co-founder of MyVet Group, where he has advised veterinarians across North America on valuation, succession, and ownership strategy. He is also leading innovation. He's also leading innovation in veterinary technology as co-founder of Nervex, bringing AI and medical devices into the future of animal care. Mark, welcome to Just Vetting.
Thank you so much, Peter. You stole my whole opening line.
I figured I'd cover it all, so we wouldn't be here for an hour. It's all good. No, I appreciate you.
Yeah, you probably saved us a lot of time.
Listen, I appreciate you coming on. I was excited about having a conversation with you. As you can see, you have a lot of irons in the fire. There's a lot of different things that you're involved in. I'm excited to talk about. Before we get into anything, in particular, tell me, after all these things that you're involved in, what drew you to veterinary medicine, and when did you know that was the path for you?
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's the start of a long journey, and probably a journey that a lot of your viewers would also, embrace as well. Like most veterinarians, I had an affinity for animals, of course, and that was despite, by the way, I was mauled as a 6-year-old by a pack of stray dogs, believe it or not. My mother had to come running outside and literally save me from these dogs that were mauling me on the ground. And you would kind of think an experience like that, Peter, would maybe turn you off of animals, and quite the opposite for me. It was really something that I really wanted to understand better, and it didn't affect me negatively in the slightest. My dad was a carpenter at the time. He owned his own carpentry business. And he was a bit of a workaholic. So the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, I suppose. But he was a bit of a workaholic, and he was spending a lot of time away from our family. So he came up to us boys. I have 2 brothers and a sister. And he came up to us boys because we were the only ones old enough to understand his proposition. And his proposition to us was, you can either have a swimming pool or you can have a farm. Those were the 2 choices. And me being the oldest and thinking maybe I was the wisest, I said to my brothers, you know what? I think we should pick the farm because we could always get a swimming pool. Now, of course, I suspect it was never our choice to begin with. I suspect that this was always my dad's choice, and probably the choice he was making to kind of bring the family together, right? So that we would always be together. And the irony is we bought a farm and it had a swimming pool. So we got the best of both worlds when we bought the farm.
You had a good choice. You did good. You didn't even know you're going to get 2 for 1 on your choice.
I did, yeah. I hedged my bets and I did all right. So I did okay. This was around grade 6, I suppose. And then as I was heading into grade 7, I was a guy who really didn't like to read. And we had to do a novel report. And so that meant you had to read a novel. And I was dreading this. I'm a science math guy. So I was dreading this idea of reading a book and then proving out, a novel report. So my grade 7 teacher gave me a book. And the book was called It Shouldn't Happen to a Vet by James Herriot. And of course, I'm sort of going to leave all of the cliches aside. I've even got James Herriot behind me on the shelf here as well. But this is a really, really common book, and a series of books, actually. As a matter of fact, there was even a TV show called All Creatures Great and Small. And these were quite inspirational to a lot of us veterinarians at those times. But in 1986, we had a devastating barn fire. My brother Rod ran up the lane. And when he came up the lane, he was screaming that the barn was on fire. And my father and I ran towards the barn. We went to the bottom of the bank barn, and we started shooing animals out of the building as quickly as we could. And we were so lucky, Peter, because a woman had saw the fire, and she drove up the laneway and she yelled into the barn, "Get out of the barn, it's collapsing." My dad and I got out, and literally within a couple of seconds, the whole building collapsed. And we lost a lot of animals that day. That day is etched in my brain forever. Just the sounds and the smells the suffering, the loss, all of these things etched themselves into my very being. And I think it was probably around this time that I really knew that, I was definitely going to be doing something with animals for the rest of my life. It was in 1987 that I worked for the Metro Toronto Zoo. I got some experience working with exotic animals there. That same year, I started my Bachelor of Science program at the University of Guelph, and everybody was applying to veterinary school. So I guess it was around that time I realized, well, this makes good sense. This is the next step for me. I'm going to go ahead and apply to veterinary school. I graduated in 1993. It's interesting when we're talking about all of this work-life balance, and I'm going to sound like an old guy here for a second, but when I graduated in 93, I was working 60 to 70 hours a week, plus on call. And this is no joke. My first 6 years, I took 2 weeks holidays.
Yeah.
That's it. I didn't do anything more than that. So like I said, like my father, who was a workaholic, I think I fell not too far from that tree. In 99, I moved to England and New Zealand. I spent a little bit of time in both of those countries practicing. And I also did part of my university education at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands too. So this is kind of a little bit about my background. I came back to my old practice after going to England and New Zealand, and I kind of fell back into that same routine, that same lack of work-life balance. And that was a tough thing. It was tough to kind of fall back into that routine, and you started to wonder to yourself, why am I doing this for somebody else? This is something I should be doing for me and my future family. So it was around that time, in around the end of 99, that I decided that I would open up my own practice. And so that's what I did. I opened up my first of 5 practices that I ended up developing, and all of the practices were de novo practices. I had never purchased a practice. In 2006, I married my soulmate, and soon after we had 2 boys in succession. 2017 was a year where I was elected the Kingston Business Person of the Year in our particular city. Mm-hmm. It's a small city. It's a small award, but it's still a nice achievement. I became a member of veterinary management groups in that same year as well. And then in 2018, a much larger award, the Ontario Veterinary Medical Association awarded me with the Award of Merit that year. And that was a real big honor to have that awarded to me in that particular circumstance. So, and during all this time, I've worked on and off for our local regulatory body as an investigator, and I continued to struggle with that work-life balance, trying to balance career and family.
I think it's just our generation.
So,
you think back, and I think we're similar age, and we grew up like that. I mean, I again, I don't want to try to sound old either, but I think when we were younger, growing up, we didn't have, you didn't hear the work-life balance, saying as much. You just did it. You worked. You were trying to make money. You wanted to buy something. You worked. You worked as, when you're a young kid, and just kept on working. Going to school, you worked. That's what you did, and that's what your parents did. I think it's changed. I think, and for whatever reason, it's just changed a lot over the last, I'd say, 5-7 years, maybe the last 10 years. It's kind of changed a little bit in terms of that.
And it's a good change.
Agreed.
You know what? It's a good change. You know what? The thing is that what's easy to do, it's easy to get buried in doing something that you love. And that's why I think a lot of veterinarians become workaholics. And I think that's why we feel the pressure of that work-life balance, because we love what we do. It's a profession that we really are metaphorically married to. And so I think sometimes we need that sort of governor. And for me, the governor was my family. My family finally were the people who kind of came to me and said, hey, wait a second. We would love to have some of your time as well. And so that's really was the genesis of me selling my practices, which I did sell all 5 of my practice in 2020. And this was not a decision, a monetary decision, Peter, because this was before, the 2021 boost that a lot of people saw. So I made this decision before that occurred, and it had nothing to do with a monetary decision. It had everything to do with putting my focus back on my family.
You mentioned, and just kind of just winding it back a little bit, you mentioned earlier, you've studied in, practiced in Canada and in the Netherlands. How do those different experiences shape your approach to veterinary care? Was it the same, different, or no? What was, how did that impact you?
There's a base ethos in veterinary medicine. And, I'm sure we'll probably get into it a little bit more as we kind of talk about some of the work that I'm currently doing. But it doesn't matter where you go. I work with practices as far away as Singapore, Europe, a lot of different locations outside of the greater North America area. As a matter of fact, we're looking currently at Brazil and Japan as well. And it doesn't seem to matter where I go and the veterinarians I meet. We all have the same basic foundational ethos, this sort of empathetic sensibility towards animals. And I think that that's really super common. As a matter of fact, I'm in the process of writing a book right now. I'm only about 1/5 of the way through it, so I've got a ways to go. It's a work in progress, but it's really all about that. It's the title of the book is called Of Creatures and Covenant. And it really talks about what is our responsibility as human beings towards these creatures. And also juxtaposing that to how that can differ, because that's really answering your question. How does that differ in different places around the world? And there are certainly some differences for sure, but there are a lot more similarities.
Looking back at those early years, what surprised you the most about the profession? You had this drive, you're thinking, oh, this is the path for me. Anything that surprised you, jumped out at you?
Yeah. I was okay with this, but I think a lot of people who entered veterinary medicine didn't always understand two things. One thing was how much interaction we have with people. Obviously we've chosen to get into this profession for the purpose of interacting with animals, but there's always a person attached to that animal. And so that's a portion of the practice or of the business, I think, that a lot of people really didn't anticipate. And I think the other side is the business side of it as well. And I would say that for a lot of practice owners, and certainly this was true for me as well, is that it almost felt a bit taboo. Taboo to look at it as a business, taboo to earn an income through this business, taboo to be successful as a veterinarian within the business, because it was something that, I think a lot of my colleagues would agree that we probably would do it for free. It's probably something we would volunteer to do. And so sometimes creating some value in what we're purveying, I think is sometimes a tough thing to do. And so it does become a little bit taboo where you kind of don't want to talk about those things because it doesn't seem right that we're talking about those things. And certainly, and you can attest to this, that the landscape has changed significantly as far as ownership models are concerned. And I think that has also probably opened the door, I think, a little bit for veterinarians to be a little bit more okay with being successful.
Right. Which, again, like work-life balance, another good thing. You work hard, you go to school, to educate yourself and then run a business. You should be rewarded, and you should be able to make a living, and a good living at that. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing to be ashamed about. There's two things you mentioned or you alluded to earlier. One, you talked about you love what you do, and I hear it's like a common thread. I think among most of your colleagues, if not all of them in the industry, this passion that drives you to do what you do. But when I was asking you before, one of the things that maybe a hurdle or a roadblock, you didn't anticipate or surprise you. I think the word you're looking at is communication, and that's a big thing when I talk to a lot of my clients and colleagues in the industry. You're right. You can communicate with the animal. You know what you need to do, but then taking that procedure and then communicating it to a client, it's something that it's not an easy transition. I was talking with somebody earlier in the week, and he had said in his mind, as an owner, he thinks that's about a year or 2 years. It's trained. It takes time. Young associates, it takes time to be able to have that confidence or be comfortable to talk with clients about a procedure or something. It's not. It can be learned. Not everybody has. Some people, you're just gifted with it, but others, you got to learn it, and it's a little bit of a struggle because you're not used to it.
I wish I were gifted at it. I think it is a
Yeah.
learned process. The one thing maybe I am gifted at is that, I am one who does
Hmm.
like people, and I love interacting with people, and I love having great conversations, especially when you can find a mutual interest or a mutual passion, right? That makes conversation easy. But, to your point, when I think about communication in the clinic, one of the most difficult times to communicate is an end
Yeah.
of life procedure. And, I would tell you that it's probably during that procedure that you may be more likely to create that bond with a client forever. And it's also a time that if things don't go quite right, it can also be a time where you lose that client. So communication is so imperative in those circumstances, as is your demeanor through
Hmm.
that process, how you are, I suppose, interpreted by the clients when you're going through that process. And listen, when I did my first euthanasia, the dialogue that I would have with clients that would preface the procedure changed dramatically over the years. And a lot of that was learned because you'd go through the procedure and maybe something new would come up, or maybe it's a different question by a client, or maybe the patient reacts in a different way. And so now you're kind of preparing the client for that procedure. And that's kind of our duty as veterinarians. We're obviously protecting the patient. We're making an end of life decision, protecting them from unnecessary pain and suffering. But we're also protecting the clients because we want to make sure that they know that they're making the right decision.
Mark, going back to again before we jump into some of your other activities, your early days. You designed and scaled, multiple practices like you talked about. What do you in your mind, most veterinarians get wrong, or could be doing differently about building a practice?
Yeah, I think it's so easy to get really caught up in the
Mm.
day to day, and it's understandable. Veterinary practices are super busy, and so finding the time to address and deal with a lot of the management issues that come up within your practice is it's hard to do that. And I think that there are ways that you can kind of scale that a little bit and make that a
Hmm.
little bit easier. Certainly by having the right kinds of staff members on your team where you can sort of delegate certain things to, for sure. But I do think you need to keep your thumb on the pulse of what's happening with the practice. Certainly from a business perspective, that's true. Typically when we visit our accountants, for example, we see them once a year. They tell us how our net income is. They reassure us of our bank account balance, and then they tell us what our
Right.
tax owings are. And typically that's sort of the end of the discussion. And really we don't have any context about how we got to that or how we can improve that. And what does that mean in terms of our overall net worth? What does it mean in terms of our current enterprise value, for example? So I think it's important that veterinarians do that. I think it's important that they kind of focus on that, trying to maintain a certain level of profitability, I think is important. So you need to know your numbers, I guess
Hmm.
is what I'm saying, Peter. There are certain key point indicators that are very valuable for veterinary practices to know and understand. And luckily for us, there's lots of benchmarks for comparing yourself to. But I'm a huge believer in culture, a typical veterinarian that way. I don't believe all value is on an
Right.
Excel document. I think that, Peter Drucker once said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of truth in that. And I'm excited for the future, and we can dig into this at
Yeah.
some point if you'd like. But I'm excited because I believe there are a lot of subjective things in practice, like culture, that we can start to quantify a little bit, get more understanding of, and start to kind of prove out this model that veterinary medicine is more than
Yeah,
just
talk to me about
numbers.
that. I wanted to ask you about what you're thinking about, and I'm always curious to hear different opinions on the future of veterinary medicine. So culture is a word. It is used so much in this industry. For somebody who's had experience working with, I'd say, business owners in the veterinary industry for the last 15 years, and then prior to that, I worked with a lot of other different business owners. Here, one of the things it drives a lot of decisions is the culture. Even when somebody's going to look to sell their practice to a corporate buyer, it's like, how are they going to treat my staff? What's the culture going to be like with that buyer? Whereas you go and sell a widget company, and I'm talking to the CEO of that widget company, I think the culture is the last thing on his or her mind. Just different here, and again, I think different for a good reason, like we're talking about. So talk to me about the future. What your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I hear the exact same thing, and of course, it aligns with my own principles, and that is that culture and autonomy are probably the two things that are most important to practice owners as they get into some kind of transition. What does my business look like afterwards? Does it maintain the same standard of care? Do we continue to give the kind of attention that our patients and clients deserve? Will our staff members maintain a certain work-life balance post? All of these things definitely absolutely come into play, and they are important, and they are things that you can demand for. There's no question that you can have those things in these particular circumstances, but it's important to use those as tools for the purpose of making sure that you get into the right kind of partnership with a particular individual or group, if it goes one of those two ways, to make sure that you're aligned with their particular principles.
Mark, is talking about maybe a particular group or an individual. What led you to or what gap did you see in the market that led you to create MyVet Group? It's kind of like a transition in that, because within MyVet Group, you're talking about mentorship and succession planning with your clients, I would assume.
Yeah. So, like most things in life, oftentimes the greatest ideas come from the experiences that we have. And as I mentioned earlier, I did sell my 5 practices. And when I sold those 5 practices, I retained my local lawyer. I retained my local accountant. As a matter of fact, my local accountant's daughter was our babysitter. Our local lawyer was a gentleman that I'm good friends with. So these are people that I know well. But what they didn't have is they didn't really have a thumb on the pulse of the veterinary industry specifically, nor did they have a specialty in the area of mergers and acquisitions. And that is my fault, because, I should have probably assumed that, because I think in legal and in accounting, much the same occurs. We have referral practices, of course, in veterinary medicine. And the same thing is true for legal and accounting. We have people like yourself and others within the accounting field who are specialists in what they do. And there's a tremendous amount of value in people who are not only educated in that field, but also have the experience within those fields as well. So as I kind of went through that process, actually it happened after the process, because after the process, I was kind of headhunted a little bit by some consolidators who really wanted me to kind of help them facilitate the acquisition of practices. And I'm like, no, hang on. That's the wrong team for me. That's not the team I'm on. One of the things I never wanted to be, Peter, is I never wanted to be a facilitator of corporatization. It's not to say that I don't believe in capitalism. Of course I do. And I think it's totally okay that situation has occurred. That being said, I think that my primary goal has been to look out for veterinary practice owners, because there was an imbalance of power in my particular situation. There was an imbalance of experience and education. And so I did exactly what I sort of alluded to, and that was my vision for MyVet Group was to build a team of specialists, bring together people from both the buy side and the sell side of the equation, and not to be a facilitator, but to be a resource. I think there's a fundamental difference between those things. We don't call ourselves brokers per se. Brokering is a component of what we do. So we look at it more as a verb than as a noun. As a noun, we're a fiduciary. As a noun, we are on the side of veterinary practice owners. And I got to tell you, this is not an underestimate or an overestimate for that matter. Probably close to 80% of the practices I work with don't end up transitioning and succeeding their practices. And you might ask yourself, well, why is that the case? Well, I think sometimes people think they want to, but I think when they start to learn a little bit more about their business, when they learn where the opportunities are to improve the business, to make it more profitable, to improve their work-life balance, a lot of them have a change of heart. A lot of them regain the passion that they once had. And so that's exciting for me as a colleague. I think that those are perfectly fine. And for those people who are certainly at that stage where they definitely want to move on, obviously we want to make sure that they get a great and fair shake.
Where do you see, when you're working with your clients, where do you see them, I guess, being most unprepared when it comes to succession planning? Is it part of it's not knowing? some of the things that you're talking about here. And then somebody like you or your team comes in and kind of advises them and maybe moves the cards around a little bit and saying, okay, maybe I don't want to transition my practice, but succession planning is something I talk with clients about all the time. So I'm always saying, and I think you and I talked about this the last time I saw you in Las Vegas about, as an owner, you want to be prepared at any given time to maybe sell your business. You want to operate it like that. Your books, records, your contracts, be ready to go so you're not scrambling at any given time. When you're ready, say, okay, I think I want to sell. And then you got to go and recreate a bunch of things, which just devalues the practice in the end.
Timing, right? So that's kind of what you're alluding to. Timing is so paramount because there are things that need to be structured in a way that optimize your exit. And to your point, they could be legal restructuring situations. They could be tax restructuring issues. From my perspective as a financial advisor, I look at, is the practice optimized? Is it an attractive practice? Have we got all the low-hanging fruit to make sure that this practice is in the best state possible so that it attracts more potential buyers? And the purpose of that is to create options and choice. And I think, one of my favorite sayings, Peter, is contrast is the mother of clarity. And so I think for people, when they're looking to make these decisions, whether it be to sell to an associate or consider a corporate exit, or maybe they want to stay in practice, they just need things fixed up. The only way to really know which choice is for you is to kind of put them all on a table and get a good understanding of that. But you need to be thinking about this. Typically we used to say in the past 2 or 3 years in advance, and I think now we're getting closer to that 3 to 5 years in advance, to kind of get these things organized. It's not to say that some practice owners aren't ready when they come to you. They certainly could be, and maybe they've got some good accounting and legal advice already on hand. But for the most part, most people don't have this prepared. And they're not anticipating that either. I think some people think that when they're thinking about an exit, that they can sell a practice and literally walk out the door the next day. And one thing that they fail to realize, and this comes back again to veterinarians not understanding their value as a person and as a veterinarian, typically speaking, practice owners are usually the greatest producers in the practice. And typically they are the cornerstone as to why people are at that practice. So losing that person devalues the practice significantly.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that point up. And I can still remember the conversation I had with a client several years ago. And I felt helpless being able to advise him in that regard because he was that guy. I mean, he had built up such a successful practice in a unique area of the country where it wasn't the most attractive location, but he had a very solid practice and he couldn't understand the value was all really hinged upon him. And if he sold, and he left, the value just wasn't going to be the same. And it was a really a come to Jesus moment with him. And I felt terrible. His best path was try to groom 1 or 2 associates to kind of build and take some of the burden away from him. But he was the key guy. He really was. And he was a little older at the time too.
We had a situation like that. Yeah, I had a situation like that as well. And it's actually a really good story and probably a good one for your viewers to hear. A relatively young veterinarian, so I would say in his late 40s. And he was looking for an exit strategy. He was a single doctor practice. He himself, by himself, was generating about $2.5 million of revenue by himself, which is crazy good for an individual.
No work-life balance for that guy.
It's no work-life balance at all. And you know what? He had a nice large practice in a great community, but this is how he ran his practice. And the way I would compare that to like a dividend stock. While he's doing that and he's generating that he was running at about a 30% margin. So, he's generating $750,000 per year of EBITDA in his practice, of cash flow in his practice. So he's doing all right. The only problem is the only thing that he was doing right was financial. He wasn't doing right by his family meaning that he was starving his family of his work-life balance. And secondly, he wasn't doing right by creating more enterprise value in his business. He had to change his mindset. And I worked with this gentleman for nearly 3.5 years. And what we did is we ended up hiring 2 more people, and we ended up getting a part-time veterinarian as well. So we took this 1 doctor practice, we converted it to a 3.5 doctor practice over 3.5 years. And we increased his enterprise value by nearly 500%.
Wow. Yeah.
That's how big a change. And what's interesting about that is as you're going through that change, they start to have second thoughts, because all of a sudden they're going, okay, you know what? Instead of working 6 days a week, I'm only working 3 days a week. This is a lot better. No, I'm not making $750,000, but on paper, my business is worth 500%.
Right, and I have that work-life balance, which I didn't even know what that was before.
And I have that work-life balance. My net worth looks better too. So all of these things kind of come into play. And I really enjoy it when veterinarians have that opportunity to kind of really make an honest decision. There has to be a lot of humility. You have to be honest with yourself. And as you go through this
it was
process.
good that he was young enough.
The only way to
one,
do
he
that.
was young enough, and 2, he was able to embrace that change and pivot. My client was,
100%.
he was on the end of his career, so that would have been very difficult for him to do at that point in time. But that's a great success story.
For sure. Yeah, these are always success stories. Any outcome where the practice owner is happy, with the results of your work is always a good outcome.
Talk to me about innovation, AI, Nervex. And again, another, I guess another arrow you got in your quiver there that you're working on. One of the many things that you're working on.
Yeah, so I actually. Right. So with Nervex Neurotechnologies, I am the co-founder and the chief veterinary officer for that company. We are a hardware AI company out of the University of Toronto. We actually have a laboratory at the Schwartz Reisman building on the University of Toronto campus. Great company. The CEO of that company is Dr. Gerard O'Leary, fantastic and brilliant young man. And we've identified something quite unique. See, a lot of people are very focused on the software of AI. And AI has this tendency, of course, it kind of rebuilds itself, right? Because first we create the AI itself, the software, which is the AI. But then, of course, AI has got to a stage where it's recreating itself and it's creating new programs. So it really feeds on itself. And really nobody has kind of given thought to the idea of what vessels through which will we use these particular modalities. And I think the one thing that I would tell your viewers, which I think is really important, especially if we're thinking about it from a medical perspective, is that a lot of what we do in medicine is episodic. So for example, we see a patient once or twice a year, we see them for 20 or 30 minutes, and that's it. Out of all the days and hours and minutes of the year, that's all we see them for. We take a blood sample, that blood sample is at a point in time. And again, if you look at the whole year as a whole, it's such a small time frame that we're actually analyzing and looking at the patient. And where I'm excited about the hardware side is I'm excited over the idea that we can do continuous monitoring. And we're doing this in human medicine already. People wear things like Apple Watches and Fitbits and that sort of thing. And those are consumer-facing products. But I'm actually talking about medical-facing products that we're actually using in the clinic, products that we're actually basically prescribing to patients for the purpose of continuous monitoring. We do that a little bit with glucose monitors, right? We do that with Holter monitors. These are tools where we can do an ECG over a longer period of time. These are tools where we can monitor real time what the glucose levels are. And I really think that that's going to really break through a lot of information that we've been missing in the past. So I'm excited about that. And that's kind of what Nervex is all about. So we're all about looking at hardware devices that we can sort of employ into the veterinary space where we can do this continuous monitoring. And we can do that even through transcription tools as well. So we work with all the major transcription companies that are out there. And we have hardware devices so that practice owners don't have to use their personal devices in the exam room. They don't have to use their computers or special microphones. These tools that we have in place are basically ambient tools. So they detect when people are present and then they can start and stop the recordings as needed and then segment them to make sure that everything's organized well. And we like that because I think even from a client's perspective, there's something uncomfortable about somebody walking into the room with a personal cell phone and recording. I know I would feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. And I probably would feel uncomfortable about my staff members using this as well.
Yeah.
Simply because, here, oh, sorry, Peter, I've got a notification. I just want to stop this podcast for a minute.
Yeah.
I've got to go look at something. Right. So it's like, I don't know. For me, there just is some issues with those kinds of things. And I think, from a client's perspective as well, I think they're going to be more open-minded if it's a tool that is considered a medical device. And we do all of our own peer-reviewed studies through the University of Toronto to make sure that our tools are, proven out to be efficacious.
Where do you see, I guess, the biggest barrier to the adoption of this and other technologies? A cost, mindset, or something else? Maybe. Yeah.
The cost of these things is so minimal because if you compare the cost of these things to the amount of efficiency that they actually develop within your practice, if you were doing, let's say anywhere from 5 to 10 extra appointments per day, that's a lot of additional revenue you can bring into your practice. And you don't even necessarily have to do that. Your decision to bring on this type of technology may not be to increase the number of appointments. It may be to get you out on time so you can have dinner with your family at home. So there's a lot of different, I suppose, purposes or motivations for taking on these kinds of technologies. But the technologies themselves, I do think, improve both standard of care. They get us excellent documentation. We can review that documentation. It reduces liability, Peter. I think you probably would get some value in sort of understanding that perspective. There's opportunity to review records to make sure that things were discussed in an appropriate way. And like I said, if it's about improving your work-life balance, nobody should be shy of making that a better situation.
We were talking about, not sounding old before, right? And then, we're talking about technology, and I'm just thinking, I guess, what skills will the next generation of veterinarians need that weren't essential 20 years ago? I know in my world, in the legal world, the younger attorneys in their 20s, they do operate no differently than somebody like myself, and how they, their desk, there's nothing on their desks at all. Whereas mine, I'm more of a hands-on type of guy. I need to write it, see it, feel it, and they look at me like I'm some type of dinosaur. And then we're also leaning, like most professions, we're also educating and leaning heavily into different AI tools to make us more efficient and productive as professionals. So I guess, looking at these veterinarians now, what do you see? What skills do you see are more essential now than ever?
Well, the most immediate one right now is that technology is outpacing regulation. And so for me, that's an important one. I just wrote an article for Praxis magazine. The title of the article was Orientation Before Acceleration. There's a lot of ethical decisions that need to be made as we're kind of evolving in this tech forward age. There's nothing wrong with tech forward, and obviously I'm an advocate for it, being involved with as many companies as I am. But I also think that we need to navigate that very carefully. And what I would encourage young veterinarians to do is participate, be a part of it. Veterinarians need to have a voice as these things evolve into our vocation. And I think it's important that we do that. Nuclear power is an amazing tool, but it can be used to power a third world country, and it can be used to bomb that same third world country. So I think it's really important that we're very careful about the tools and the technologies that we're building, and making sure that veterinarians have a say in terms of the direction that they're going, and maybe even a portion of that on the regulation of those things too. We have certain ethics that we need to uphold when it comes to the practice of veterinary medicine. And these types of tools will be integrated into those components of practice. So we need to be considerate to those things. The other thing that young veterinarians, into the future need to be aware of, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is the idea of continuous monitoring. We're going to learn a lot of things as continuous monitoring becomes more, tech forward. And so we're going to need to continue to improve our continuing education resources. You know, they say that knowledge is improving so quickly. You know, I remember somebody saying one time, talking about the sort of the half-life of knowledge or medical knowledge. And as little as 10, 15 years ago, it was like every 3 to 4 years, the medical knowledge needed to be updated. And I heard that today we're talking about every 2 to 3 months, you need to update your medical knowledge because things are moving that quickly. So veterinarians, young veterinarians, are going to need to keep up to date on things quite routinely. And I think that's going to be really, really important for them in the future as well. You know, like I said, I think participation is a big part of it. I think that veterinarians need to participate in this and have a voice.
And one thing that you said earlier that kind of resonated with me when you look to sell, when you were looking to sell your practices, you know, you hired your local accountant, your local lawyer. I think again, talking from others in the industry, one of the good positives that's changed there are more dedicated professionals, I think, than ever before within the industry. A lot of us are members of professional associations like Vet Partners, but there are groups of professionals, whether it's a consultant, lawyer, accountant, bankers. I refer to them as your team, and I think younger veterinarians have those resources available to them, where I think more senior veterinarians, they weren't as available back then, or they weren't aware of them, where a lot of us are going to these conferences, we're meeting with and having conversations like you and I have had in the past, where you could put your team together, in any stage of your career, whether you're coming out of vet school and you're going to look to associate, or you're looking to start up, buy in, what have you, having your team around you. I guess, what advice would you give, veterinarians or young veterinarian considering practice ownership, based upon, your experiences as an owner?
So much has changed. It used to be one single model. Only veterinarians could own veterinary clinics. And that was a pretty easy model to work with. And I think back in those times as well, when we had our associations who are, guardians of our vocation, oftentimes if we faced a particular issue, if we go back to, say, the 2008 recession, they could create a sort of a broad stroke, ubiquitous response and say, everybody do this. I was part of a panel this past winter, and part of this panel was dealing with some of the headwinds that we have in veterinary medicine right now. Revenues are a bit flat, invoices are down, consumer confidence is a little bit low. So how do we deal with this? And we can't broad stroke anymore. And getting to answering your question, I think it's because we have so many different models of ownership that are out there right now. So independent practices, of course, will always be here. They will be here to stay. And they, in my mind's eye, will always be the most successful. They're going to be fantastic because you have, the person's vested interest in the vocation that they've chosen to be successful in. So I think those practices will always do well. We have the corporate practices, and they've changed things within our profession. They've made us more aware of the business side of things. They've made us more astute. They've created a more competitive environment. They've made us understand our key point indicators better than we've ever understood them before. So we've learned a lot from them as well. And, I think part of the future for ownership is hybrid models. And that's kind of what you were alluding to, this idea that I don't necessarily have to have another veterinarian as my partner. I could have Peter Tanella as my partner. Peter and I could go start a practice tomorrow. It could be a business friend of mine. It could be a friend of mine who's excellent with HR and marketing, and maybe they'd be a great partner because I don't know anything about HR and marketing. So maybe that's the person I would like to have as my partner. And so each person within that group really has their own portfolio within the business. My portfolio is pretty obvious. I'm the veterinarian. So this is where I want my autonomy, is in the veterinary space. And really that's what I'm about, protecting. I'm one of the visionaries and operating partners for Royal Vet. And that's exactly what Sam Federer and I helped to create. We have a number of practices in Miami and Montreal. And that was really our goal. Our goal was to create, an ownership model that really invites different people to come together and work together for the best interests of patients and clients.
Yeah, I think we get contacted by a new client almost once a month, if not more, with those types of ownership model ideas, whether it's the veterinarian who's contacting us or the business partner, depending on what state they're in. And most of the time they're like, oh, I want to do four or five, 10 locations. I said, why don't we just start with one? Let's focus on one. Let's put the model in place, get successful, and then you can start, scaling. But and some already have been successful in the past. But you're right. That is, I didn't when I first got into the industry. That wasn't something that you saw. But now, it's very commonplace where the owners. It's just. Obviously, you need to have somebody there like yourself, who's a professional and a doctor. But a lot of times, you have various business owners who are, just specialty in some type of business. I agree with you 100%. It's different. Times have changed, so more opportunities.
Times have totally changed. Yeah, AHA makes an excellent chart of accounts. And what's really important about having a very detailed chart of accounts is the ability to make good comparisons. So that if you're comparing yourself to other practices, comparing your key point indicators to benchmarks within that particular model, then that's super important, especially if you're comparing yourself to a very similar practice in a similar region. However, I think, we're going to see major changes when it comes to pricing within veterinary medicine. And again, a lot of associations in the past have created fee schedules, recommendations to veterinarians to put certain prices for certain services and certain products at certain levels. And I'm not sure that we can broad stroke that anymore, Peter. I think there's just so many different models that are out there. The social economics change from state to state. The type of practice, whether it be general, urgent care, specialty, emergency, there's a lot of different models that are out there. And, as we're seeing more and more products move into the direct-to-consumer range, veterinarians need to be really focused. We need to be focused on, getting that balance between service and products, where services are much higher. In the past, we typically ran a 60-40 split, services to products. Great practices are running at 70-30, and probably over time, we're going to probably march that towards 80-20. Veterinarians need to continue to value what they do with their hands.
One last question before we kind of wrap up. Where do you see the relationship between independent practice owners and corporate groups going in the future? You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, and I suppose it opens up a can of worms a little bit. I think that there is this juxtaposition for sure. Independent practice owners have recognized that the public has become aware of the corporatization of veterinary medicine. So independent practice owners in many situations are leveraging that to some degree. That being said, there's a lot of great corporate groups out there as well that have done an amazing job, at encouraging a high standard of care, providing work-life balance for their staff, excellent benefits programs as well. And so I think it's a circumstance where there's a coexistence that's going to occur. Corporate practices are not going to disappear. Even with MyVet Group, we see new entrants coming into the marketplace all the time. So even if a particular corporate group is saying, yeah, we're kind of going to slow down a little bit, we're not going to get into too many more acquisitions, along comes another group who wants to get back into this as well. So, veterinary medicine is an attractive business, and it's attractive because you have committed people with successful businesses. And so I think we're always going to draw the attention of those who are looking at it from a monetary perspective. The key is that if you're a practice owner looking for an exit strategy and making those kinds of considerations, is making sure that you get sort of paired up with a company or with an individual or a group that meets your base ethos, that meets your specific goals. It's so important to do that. You need to be able to walk away from the situation making sure that you feel as though that you made all the right decisions.
Yeah, going back to that culture, right? I mean, I always say, right. I always
Right
say,
back to it.
money is important to everybody. It's human nature, right? But at the same time, the money's going to be there. It's okay. What are the things that are important to you? So at the end of the day, when you get to that, the closing table, you say, this is, I'm glad we're doing this, as opposed to being, remorseful about something that you're doing. What's next
Absolutely.
for you, Mark? And in terms of all
Absolutely.
the different things that you're working on, I guess what do you see next for you over next few months or a year ahead?
Yeah, I'm working with another new group out of California, Dr. Dick Gebhardt and Todd Tams and John Corsale. Great group of guys, and a lot of the focus that they're looking at is, I would probably put it under the category of access to care. That's been a real problem as well, especially with prices going up, especially with HR resources being deficient. And I think it's really important as veterinarians that we try to find ways to improve access to care. So those guys are doing an amazing job by, they've created a suite of products. They have a practice hub, which looks at a lot of the management, but it's not just a PIMS program. It's really a program that incorporates a lot of different components, including things like CE or local, municipal, and state laws and things like that. Client communication, a lot of different components that come into play. They also have a thing called veterinary fee analytics, which I think is wonderful. It's hyper focused on the individual practice. So no longer are you to go and look at some sort of standardized fee schedule. What we do is we look at time and motion studies to do an exact calculation in terms of what you as a practice should be charging for that particular item, which is both fair to the client in full transparency, but also good for the practice. And I think those are really smart. And then the third thing that they've created is a tool called Petsopia. And Petsopia is a very interesting tool because it develops a communication link between veterinarians and owners, and making sure that those two groups are acquiring their data from the same resources, the same curated, peer-reviewed resources, which I think is super important. And it allows manufacturers the opportunity to provide access to clients, whether it be through things like coupons or discounts or whatever the case may be, but ultimately to improve access to care.
Well, that's yeah.
It's cool stuff.
It's cool stuff among all the other things you're doing. And I'll end on this last question and kind of, ending where we began. How do you stay grounded, as a professional and as a husband, a father, with all the different roles that you're juggling? I mean, just kind of like when you were talking about earlier, when at the outset about work-life balance. I mean, no joke, you're involved on a lot of different activities because you have a passion for it. How do you balance and stay grounded while you're juggling those various roles?
My grandfather once said to me that the busiest person has the most time. And I never really understood what that meant, because as a busy person owning 5 practices, I had no time.
You're like a liar, fake news.
So I never really knew what
news.
that meant.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So here's how I've come to terms with that, how I've reconciled that. It's really not about the busiest person having the most time. It's typically meaning that the busiest person is usually the person who's able to organize and schedule their time appropriately. And so what does that mean? Well, it means creating boundaries. Mm-hmm. That's what it does. And it means being efficient with the time that you have. And so that's essentially the way my life works right now. I'm efficient with the time that I give, and I'm dedicated for the time that I'm putting my best foot forward with. So I think that that's really what it comes down to. And obviously I do a lot of my work from home. I do a lot of traveling. I'm at all the major conferences. As you know, I speak at all the major conferences as well. So, that does take some time, but I'm present. And the word present, Peter, is, you can use that both literally and metaphorically. I'm present because here I am in my home right now. And, when it's time to have dinner, I'm going to move my way over to the dinner table. But I'm also present mentally. And that's the tougher one. Because, when I had the 5 practices, and I came home late for dinner, I didn't disconnect. I was always connected. And so I think it's important. And I would encourage veterinarians I would encourage all people to do that. I would encourage everybody to always try to find a way to kind of, create guardrails on those things. Put in your best efforts for the time that you have, and make sure you disconnect and connect with the people that
Great
matter
point,
most.
and it's very true. And I think a lot of us have a difficulty doing that, but it's really important. Mark. Yeah,
It's really tough to
I
do.
always enjoy our conversations. It's great seeing you, and I look forward to getting together with you in person. At the next conference that we're together. But I appreciate you joining me on Just Vetting today.